They laughed at his cabin, calling it absurd and unfit for the harsh wilderness. But when the brutal winter settled in, it wasn't their structures that held strong. It was his. Samuel Bridger's hollow log cabin would not only protect him from the storms, but save his life when the world outside seemed bent on destroying him. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Samuel Bridger stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing out over the vast expanse of snow-covered hills that stretched endlessly before him. The wind howled through the trees, biting with a cold that could freeze the very marrow in a man's bones. His cabin, if you could call it that, stood as a testament to his obsession with survival. A hollow log carved out meticulously and placed to offer the best possible shelter. No one had believed in his design, not at first. It was too unconventional, too out of place in the world of frontier cabins built with stone, wood, and the traditional methods passed down through generations. Yet Samuel was never one to follow tradition. He didn't care about the scorn or the ridicule of other mountain men. Their ideas had failed them, time and time again. He had seen it with his own eyes, their poorly constructed homes torn apart by grizzly bears, their doors broken down by the fury of winter's worst. Samuel had learned early on that the wilderness wasn't a place for the weak or the lazy. You had to think, adapt, or perish. The cabin before him was no ordinary shelter. It was a work of ingenuity. Its walls were the natural wood of the log itself, unmarked by the gaps and weaknesses of traditional construction. It stood firm against the elements, its thick bark offering insulation from the frigid mountain air. Samuel had spent weeks perfecting the design, using tools that no one else in the area could afford or understood. His cabin wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a fortress, built to withstand the very worst the Rocky Mountains could throw at him. His thoughts drifted back to the time when he had first begun the work. It hadn't been an easy decision. The others had laughed when they saw the hollowed-out log, mocked him for his eccentricity. But he had known the risks. Grizzly bears were a constant threat, and he had seen too many men lose their lives to animals that had torn their cabins apart in search of food. The thought of dying like that, the thought of his body being torn apart, helpless against the sheer strength of nature, kept him up at night. Yet here he was, standing proudly outside the very structure that would keep him safe. He knew the storm was coming, the winds had started to pick up, and the temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it in the air. Winter had arrived early this year, and with it the challenge of surviving another season in the wilderness. It was late afternoon when the storm finally hit. The wind began to howl like a wild animal, whipping the snow across the ground in blinding sheets. Samuel didn't waste any time. He stoked the fire inside the cabin, ensuring the flames roared high, sending waves of warmth into the cold air. He had learned long ago that the key to surviving in the mountains wasn't just the shelter you built, it was how you maintained it. The hearth was the heart of the home, and without it, survival was impossible. Outside, the world was rapidly turning into a frozen wasteland. The snow piled up quickly, obscuring the landscape. The howl of the wind against the cabin walls felt like a constant threat, as if nature itself was testing the integrity of his work. Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation rise within him. He had prepared for this moment, built his cabin to withstand this very storm. It was a test, one he couldn't fail. He settled into his chair by the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle. The warmth was comforting, but his mind couldn't rest. He had spent months planning for this. Every log had been carefully selected, every corner fitted with precision. He knew that the test would come soon enough. The real challenge was yet to begin. As the night wore on, the wind grew fiercer, rattling the walls of his cabin. The howling sound filled the air, a constant reminder of the danger outside. But inside, Samuel was warm. His cabin was standing strong just as he had hoped. But the true test didn't come from the wind. It didn't come from the cold either. It came in the form of a low guttural growl that echoed from the darkness beyond. Samuel stood up slowly, his heart racing. The sound was unmistakable. A bear. It had come just as he had feared. The grizzly was out there, prowling the perimeter of his cabin, searching for any weakness, any way in. Samuel didn't panic. He knew this was the moment, the test he had been waiting for. He grabbed his rifle, moving toward the window with careful, deliberate steps. The bear's growl was louder now, and Samuel could hear its claws scraping against the logs outside. His hands were steady, his breath controlled. He peered through the small gap in the window, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. There it was, a massive shape, moving in the dark. It was circling the cabin, testing the strength of the door, the corners, the weak points. But Samuel knew his cabin wouldn't break. The logs were solid, the construction foolproof. The bear would have to try harder than that. The night dragged on, and Samuel remained vigilant. The bear prowled, growling and testing, but the cabin stood firm. When the dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. The bear was gone, and Samuel's cabin had passed its first true test. The mocking voices of the other trappers, the ridicule he had endured, felt distant now. He had proven them wrong. Samuel Bridger's hollow log cabin had held, and with it, his future in the mountains seemed secure. Despite the storm's passing and the bear's retreat, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. He knew the wilderness was full of eyes, animals, yes, but also the curious gaze of the other mountain men. Even after the storm had settled, he could feel the weight of their doubts pressing on him. It had been 2 days since the bear had circled his cabin, but Samuel still couldn't quite relax. The fire in the hearth was still burning brightly, and the warmth it gave off was the only comfort against the bitter chill of the mountain air. He had done everything right. He had built a cabin that was designed to stand against the fiercest storms and the strongest bears. But deep down, he knew that the world outside wasn't so easily conquered. It wasn't just about surviving one storm, it was about facing down the years, the relentless grind of the frontier, and proving that his design was more than just a novelty. That night, as Samuel sat by the fire, he heard a sound outside. A voice, a familiar voice. It was a sound he hadn't expected, yet one he had been waiting for. "Samuel, you in there?" It was John Hoffman, his old trapping partner. Samuel hadn't seen him in months, not since the spring trapping season. He hadn't expected anyone to visit, especially not now in the dead of winter. He stood slowly, his muscles stiff from the long hours of work in the cold, and walked to the door. The thick logs felt solid beneath his touch as he opened it, revealing John standing in the snow, his face haggard and windburned. "Thought you might need some company," John said with a half-smile, pulling his coat tighter around him to shield against the cold. Samuel stepped aside to let him in, still surprised. John was the last person he expected to show up in this desolate part of the mountains. But then again, maybe it was exactly what Samuel needed. For weeks he had been alone in his thoughts, consumed with the worry that the others might be right about his cabin. That somehow, despite the tests, he was just a fool with a strange idea. John stepped inside, looking around at the hollow log cabin. His eyes widened at the sight, taking in the warm fire, the walls built with logs that seemed to breathe strength. "Samuel, this is something else." He paused for a moment, then added, "I gotta admit, I didn't believe you when I heard about it. Thought you were crazy, actually. But now, seeing it with my own eyes." Samuel nodded, his gaze shifting to the fire. "I knew it was the only way. The wilderness doesn't care about tradition. It's about survival." John clapped a hand on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the work that Samuel had done. They sat down by the fire, the warmth filling the small cabin, and the crackling of the logs adding to the peace. But even in the silence of the night, Samuel knew the question still, lingered in John's mind and in his own. Could he really continue living in a place so different, so strange to the others? Would his success be enough to silence the doubts, or would he always be the man who built his home out of a hollow log? The next morning, as the sun peeked over the ridge, John was ready to head out. He had his own trap lines to check, his own work to do. But as he gathered his things, he paused, looking at Samuel one last time. "You've got something here, Samuel," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I was wrong about your cabin. I'll be back. I'll tell the others. Maybe it's time they stopped laughing." Samuel watched him go, the weight of his words settling deep within him. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The days passed slowly, each one marked by the silent ticking of the winter clock. The snow continued to fall in thick, relentless layers, coating the world in a blanket of white. Samuel had spent much of the time reinforcing his cabin, checking the structure for any weaknesses, and maintaining the firewood supply to keep the hearth going. It wasn't just about survival now. It was about proving something to himself. He was no longer content with simply enduring the seasons. He needed to know if his cabin would stand the test of time, if he could trust it not just to survive one storm or one bear attack, but to keep him safe through the years, through everything the wilderness could throw at him. Each day he worked harder, adjusting and perfecting his creation, learning new ways to adapt. Despite the solitude, Samuel had made a habit of checking his surroundings, walking the perimeter of the cabin to make sure everything was intact. He had heard of other trappers who had been caught unaware, their homes destroyed by the very forces they had once relied on. He didn't want to be one of those men. One cold morning, after weeks of isolation, Samuel ventured down to the nearby stream to check his trap lines. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of his boots in the snow. He walked for miles, the cold air biting at his skin, but it was a familiar discomfort, one he had grown accustomed to over the years. As he approached the stream, something caught his eye. Tracks. Fresh tracks, wide and deep, marked in the snow. He knelt down to examine them closely. The unmistakable sign of a grizzly bear. His pulse quickened, but he remained calm. He had faced down bears before, and his cabin had withstood the last one. But there was something about this set of tracks that made his blood run cold. They were too close, too recent. Samuel scanned the area, his heart pounding in his chest. The bear was nearby. He could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against the trees, hiding just beyond the edge of his sight. Slowly, carefully, he made his way back toward the cabin. The tracks continued in the direction of his home, and his thoughts raced as he moved. If the bear was coming to investigate his shelter, this would be the ultimate test. The first real threat to his cabin since he had built it. Would it hold? As he reached the clearing near his cabin, Samuel's worst fears were confirmed. The bear had already arrived. It was standing at the base of the cabin, sniffing the air, testing the perimeter, just as it had the first time. It was bigger than the last one, a full-grown male with thick fur and powerful limbs. Samuel didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly into position, making sure to stay out of the bear's line of sight. He knew that his cabin would stand strong. This wasn't the time for doubt. This was the test of a lifetime, and he was ready to face it. The bear was not like the others. It stood on its hind legs, towering over the cabin, its massive form blocking the weak light of the overcast sky. Samuel could hear the low growl, a deep rumble vibrating through the snow as the bear circled the perimeter of the hollow log cabin. This wasn't just an ordinary animal looking for food. This bear was testing. It was studying his creation as though it understood that this was not just another man-made shelter. Samuel's breath caught in his chest. The rifle was heavy in his hands, but he didn't raise it yet. His fingers tightened around the stock, but his mind was calm, focused. The bear was determined, its claws scraping against the logs as it tested for weaknesses. Samuel had no doubt that it was looking for any chink in his cabin's armor, just as the last one had. The cold winds howled through the trees, but inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire was a constant, reassuring presence. Yet, the reality of the situation could not be ignored. The bear was here, and it wasn't leaving until it had found a way in, or until Samuel made sure it didn't. His cabin, built with such care and attention, was now being scrutinized by nature's fiercest predator. Samuel had spent countless hours perfecting every log, reinforcing every corner. The iron pins that held the logs together were meant to prevent exactly this, forceful entry from a determined creature. But seeing the sheer size and power of the bear, Samuel wondered, would it be enough? He slowly moved to the gun port that he had installed when first designing the cabin. It was a narrow slit, hidden in the logs, offering him a perfect view of the bear. The gun port had been a last-minute addition, something he'd thought might be useful, but hadn't fully appreciated until now. Through the small opening, he saw the bear's claws scratch at the doorframe, a sound that reverberated through the stillness of the morning. The animal was persistent, methodical. Samuel could see its eyes narrowing as it sniffed the air, trying to determine if this cabin was worth the effort. His heartbeat quickened, the stillness of the world around him becoming suffocating. It was then that Samuel knew this bear wasn't just curious, it was hungry. And worse, it wasn't going to stop until it had destroyed what it had come for. With a deep breath, Samuel raised his rifle, aiming through the gun port. He hesitated for just a moment, unsure if he should take the shot. The bear was close, so close that he could feel its presence pressing against the walls, yet Samuel didn't pull the trigger. This wasn't the time for that. He wasn't hunting the bear. He was defending his home, his life. The bear moved, dragging its claws along the wood with a terrifying screech. Samuel knew this was the moment. He fired. The shot rang out across the valley, the loud crack of the rifle cutting through the silence. The bear staggered back, momentarily stunned. Samuel's pulse raced, but the bear wasn't done. It roared in fury, its massive form turning toward the source of the attack. It was clear now. The bear wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Samuel. The bear recoiled after the shot, its fur matted with the first signs of blood, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it shook itself off with terrifying strength and lunged again, this time toward the corner of the cabin where the logs met the earth. Samuel's heart raced as the bear's claws scraped against the wood, testing, searching for any weakness. The impact rattled the entire structure. He raised the rifle again, steadying his aim, but the beast was too close. He needed another strategy. The rifle would only scare it away temporarily. What good would it do if the bear came back, stronger, angrier, more determined? The cabin's strength was the key to his survival, but he knew he couldn't rely on it completely. The bear had found one way to challenge it. There had to be another. Samuel's mind raced, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. He had prepared for everything. But this was the test of his will. The fire still burned inside the cabin, but the heat seemed far away now, lost in the frenzy outside. The bear was relentless, raking at the walls with its claws, pressing harder as if to break through the strong structure he had spent months perfecting. Samuel felt the weight of his design, every log, every nail, every decision, coming to a point of no return. He grabbed a second rifle that he had kept beside the door, a larger, more powerful weapon, and loaded it with a heavier round. This time, he wouldn't miss. He had only one shot. He had to make it count. Samuel moved swiftly to the gun port, his hand steady despite the urgency. The bear was still circling, this time trying to break the door. He watched it test the iron hinges, pulling at the structure as if it could tear it apart with brute strength alone. He aimed carefully, his eye on the bear's broad side. It was the perfect shot. But as he squeezed the trigger, time seemed to stretch in slow motion. The shot rang out, the powerful round slamming into the bear's flank. For a moment the animal froze. The tension in the air was palpable. Then, with a deafening roar, the bear collapsed, crumpling under the force of the bullet. Its massive body hit the ground with a thunderous thud, the silence that followed even more unsettling. Samuel exhaled slowly, the rifle trembling in his hands. He had done it. The bear was down, but the battle wasn't just against the animal. It was a battle against the wilderness itself, a constant reminder that no matter how strong you built something, it could always be tested. He stood in the doorway watching the fallen beast for a long moment. The storm outside had passed, but for Samuel, the real storm was just beginning. The silence that followed the bear's death felt like a heavy, suffocating weight, pressing against the cabin walls. Samuel stood at the door, rifle in hand, watching the lifeless body of the creature as it lay sprawled in the snow. The fire inside the cabin crackled softly, a stark contrast to the wild intensity that had just occurred. The warmth from the flames now felt like an unfamiliar luxury, the safety it offered all the more precious after the trial. But Samuel knew that the victory, however significant, came at a cost. As he stepped back from the doorway, closing it to shield himself from the cold, his mind began to race. He had survived, but the wilderness had shown him once again that it was unforgiving. The bear had come at night, seeking shelter or food, and it had found neither. Instead, it had found resistance. But what about the next one, or the next storm? Samuel had built his cabin to withstand the elements, but no structure, no matter how meticulously crafted, was invincible. The reality of his isolation settled in once more. As much as he took pride in his work, as much as the hollow log cabin stood strong, he was still alone. The weight of his choices, the countless hours spent working the land, and the constant vigilance required to maintain his safety, it was all beginning to wear on him. The solitude was a constant companion, and even though the fire inside offered warmth, it did little to dispel the deep, gnawing ache of being far removed from any form of human connection. Samuel moved toward the fire, his boots crunching softly on the wooden floor. He added another log to the flame, watching the way the wood sparked and crackled. The room was small, simple, but it was home. The hollow log cabin was his fortress, and for all its imperfections, it had proven its worth. Yet, as Samuel thought about the days ahead, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his decisions. The wilderness was full of dangers, yes, but it also carried with it a profound sense of independence. It gave you the power to stand on your own, to face challenges head-on. But it also stripped you of the things that made life truly worth living: companionship, shared laughter, the simple joy of a meal with others. The price of living out here, on the edge of the frontier, was not just the risk of wildlife or the punishing winters, it was the sacrifice of everything that connected him to the world beyond the mountains. He was aware of it now, the loneliness creeping into his bones like the cold. It was a different kind of test, one that no rifle or log cabin could protect him from. It was the kind of test that gnawed away at a man's spirit over time, wearing down the resolve until there was nothing left but the endless expanse of snow and silence. But Samuel knew he couldn't turn back. This was his life now. He had chosen this path, and the hollow log cabin was his testament to that choice. He would survive, as he always had, but for how long, and at what cost? The next few days passed in quiet reflection. Samuel kept to his usual routine, checking his traps, chopping wood, and maintaining the cabin. The bear's body had been dragged into the woods, where its remains would serve as a lesson to other creatures. He had no desire to leave the carcass out where it might attract more wildlife, especially not during the depths of winter, when the animals were hungry and desperate. As he worked, he found himself thinking of John Hoffman's visit, the first in so long, and the words John had spoken. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was time for him to seek out others. The idea had been foreign to him for years. He had spent so long believing that survival on the frontier was about independence, that self-reliance was the highest virtue. But now, after the bear, after the storm, after everything he had faced on his own, he wondered if there was more to life than just surviving. He had built his cabin to keep himself safe, to keep the wilderness at bay, but there was no denying the fact that the wilderness had begun to chip away at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The storm had brought with it more than just snow and cold. It had brought a harsh realization. Living in isolation wasn't just about outlasting the elements. It was about finding a balance between self-sufficiency and the need for connection. And as much as Samuel hated to admit it, he knew that he had reached a point where he could no longer keep going alone. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as Samuel sat by the window, staring out into the vast white expanse. The snow was still falling, thick and heavy, blanketing everything in a pristine layer. The world outside looked so serene, so untouched. But beneath the calm, Samuel knew that the wilderness was never truly still. It was always waiting, always testing, always threatening. The thought of leaving his cabin to find others felt like a betrayal, a failure to what he had worked so hard to achieve. The hollow log had been his refuge, his triumph over the wild, but now it felt more like a prison, a place that had sheltered him physically, but not emotionally. He had isolated himself, built a fortress of wood and iron, but he had failed to fortify the parts of him that needed warmth beyond fire and safety beyond walls. Samuel didn't know what the next step would be, but he knew he couldn't stay in this same place forever. The cabin had served him well, but it wasn't enough anymore. He needed to see beyond its walls, to find some measure of connection with the world he had once known. The wilderness was vast and unyielding, but maybe it was time to face the world outside, where others lived and shared in the hardships together. Tomorrow he would go. Tomorrow he would find someone to share this journey with. But for tonight, the fire would burn, the cabin would stand, and Samuel would reflect on the lessons the wilderness had taught him, and how he would carry them forward. The following morning, Samuel stood at the threshold of his cabin, gazing out into the snow-covered wilderness. The storm had finally subsided, and the world beyond his doorstep lay in quiet, untouched stillness. His cabin was a solitary figure amid the vast white landscape, standing resolute, as if daring the wilderness to come at it again. But Samuel knew it wasn't enough anymore. The solitude had become a suffocating presence, pressing against him with a weight he could no longer bear. It was time to leave. The decision had come to him slowly, but it had been building for weeks, maybe longer. After the bear attack, after the stillness of the mountain nights, Samuel had realized something that had been eluding him for years. Survival wasn't just about strength and self-reliance. It was about sharing in the struggle. It was about finding people who understood what it meant to face the wilderness and weather its storms together. He didn't know where he would go, but it didn't matter. He wasn't just walking away from his cabin. He was walking towards something. The path ahead, shrouded in snow and uncertainty, was the one less traveled. But that was the path he had to take. Samuel packed what little gear he could carry, some food, a flint, a hunting knife, and left the rest of his belongings behind. The cabin was quiet now, the fire gone out, leaving only the echo of what had been. The walls of his hollow log cabin had stood firm against the test of the wilderness, but it had also kept him from the world beyond its doors. As he trudged through the snow, Samuel's thoughts were consumed by the journey ahead. He had no real plan, no map or clear direction. All he had was the need for change, for something more than what he had built in isolation. The mountains were still, their jagged peaks looming overhead like silent sentinels, watching his every step. He had spent years in these mountains, but he had never truly explored them. Now the world beyond the familiar paths called to him. The trail was difficult to follow. The snow was deep and the wind picked up again, biting at his exposed skin. The cold gnawed at him, but he kept moving, putting one foot in front of the other. His breath puffed in the frigid air, a cloud of vapor that disappeared into the endless white. For the first time in what felt like years, Samuel didn't feel alone in the mountains. He was walking toward something, toward a new beginning. Hours passed and the sun began to dip low in the sky. The thought of finding shelter for the night weighed on him, but there was no turning back now. He couldn't help but think about his cabin, standing alone against the coming storm. It had been his safe place, his home for so long, but now it felt more like a prison. As the daylight faded, Samuel found a small cave tucked away beneath a rock outcropping. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for one night. He built a fire and sat close to the warmth, letting the crackling flames calm his mind. As the firelight danced across the walls of the cave, Samuel couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right decision. But as the snow continued to fall outside, he knew there was no turning back. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only road left to take. Samuel awoke to the harsh, cold light of early morning, the fire in the cave having burned out during the night. The snow outside had continued to fall, and a thick blanket of it covered the ground, making the world outside look even more remote and unwelcoming. But there was something invigorating about it, the idea of stepping into the unknown, of leaving the comfort of his cabin behind, and embracing the uncertainty of the wilderness. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt alive. He packed up his meager belongings and set out once more, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he moved forward. The path was difficult to follow, but the wind had died down, and the sky was clearer than it had been in days. As he made his way through the wilderness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The thought crept into his mind, but he brushed it aside. It was probably just the stillness of the mountains playing tricks on him. But as he rounded a bend in the trail, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the clearing ahead, was a figure, a man standing motionless. The figure was dressed in a heavy coat, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a fur hat pulled low over his face. He looked as though he had come from the very same wilderness that Samuel had been wandering for so long. The man didn't move at first. Neither of them spoke. Samuel's heart raced, his instincts telling him to be wary. It wasn't uncommon to find other trappers or travelers in these mountains, but something about this encounter felt different. After a long, tense silence, the man spoke, his voice low and gruff. "You're a long way from home, friend. What brings you out here?" Samuel hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The man's presence was unsettling, but not threatening. He had to admit, though, that he hadn't expected to find anyone else out here, especially not so deep in the mountains. "I'm looking for something," Samuel replied, his voice steady but guarded. "I've been living alone for too long. It's time for a change." The man nodded, as if understanding more than Samuel had said. "I've been out here a long time too," he said. "The mountains can make a man feel like he's the only one left. But sometimes a man finds what he's looking for when he least expects it." Samuel frowned, not quite sure what the man meant, but he didn't press. Instead, he took a step closer, extending a hand. "I'm Samuel," he said simply. "And you are?" The man's eyes flickered with recognition, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Call me Elias. I've been in these mountains a long time, just like you. But I reckon we're both looking for something more than the wilderness can offer." It was then that Samuel realized he wasn't as alone as he had believed. The wilderness was vast, but it wasn't empty. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt the stirrings of hope. Maybe this encounter, unexpected as it was, would lead to something more than survival. Samuel sat across from Elias, the fire crackling between them as the warmth spread through the small clearing. The air was crisp and cold, but the shelter of the cave offered refuge from the harsh winds outside. Elias's presence, quiet but steady, was a welcome change from the solitude Samuel had grown accustomed to. It wasn't often that Samuel had the chance to converse with someone beyond the occasional encounter with a fellow trapper, but this felt different. The way Elias carried himself, the depth in his eyes, suggested more than just a casual wanderer. The fire flickered in the night, casting long shadows on the cave walls. Elias's story was one of hardship and survival, but it was also a tale of longing for something deeper than the constant battle against nature. Like Samuel, Elias had been drawn to the mountains, but for different reasons. He had lost his family to illness years ago, and ever since had been drifting, seeking solace in the isolation the mountains provided. "You ever think you'll find what you're looking for out here?" Elias asked, his voice low, a trace of something unspoken in his tone. Samuel leaned back, resting his hands on the ground behind him. He stared into the fire, watching the orange glow dance on the logs. His life had been one of building, of surviving, of creating something that could withstand the world's harshest tests. But now, in this moment, as he sat across from Elias, he realized he was no longer sure what he was truly seeking. "I thought I had everything figured out," Samuel replied slowly. "I built a cabin that could withstand a bear, a storm, anything nature could throw at it. But in the end, I was the one who wasn't strong enough to withstand the silence." Elias nodded, understanding far too well. "The wilderness has a way of making you face things you'd rather avoid. It strips you down to the bare essentials, makes you question everything." The words resonated with Samuel in ways he hadn't expected. He had spent years building his fortress, thinking it would shield him from everything, including the aching loneliness that had begun to creep into his heart. But now, with Elias sitting across from him, Samuel felt something stir, a hope that hadn't been there for a long time. "You know," Elias continued, "I've learned that survival isn't just about fending off what's outside. It's about finding a way to keep going, to live in spite of everything, even when the world feels empty. And sometimes that means sharing your journey with someone else." The idea of sharing his journey was foreign to Samuel. He had always thought of himself as self-sufficient, as someone who could weather the storms alone. But the truth was, he had never been fully alone in the mountains. Not really. The mountains had always been there, as had the earth, the animals, and the elements. But now Elias was here. He was a reminder that survival wasn't just about building walls. It was about finding those moments of connection, even in the vast wilderness. That night, as they sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, Samuel realized that the journey he had been on was not about escaping the world. It was about learning to exist within it, alongside others. The cabin had been a refuge, but it was time for him to venture out again, to learn what it meant to share the road, to find purpose not just in surviving, but in living. The next morning, Samuel and Elias packed their belongings, preparing to leave the shelter of the cave. The snow had settled, but the cold was still biting, the early winter air sharp against their skin. Samuel felt a quiet sense of anticipation building inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't fear, nor was it excitement. It was a mix of emotions, an understanding that he was on the cusp of something new, a new chapter in his life, a new direction for his journey. They set out together, walking side by side through the snow-covered terrain, the tracks of their boots leaving deep impressions in the fresh powder. The mountains around them were imposing, their rugged beauty as untamed and wild as ever. Samuel had spent years trying to conquer these mountains, to make them bend to his will. But now, with Elias beside him, he realized that there was no need to conquer the wilderness. The wilderness didn't need conquering. It needed respect, understanding. As they walked, their conversation turned from survival tactics to life itself. Elias spoke of his travels across the West, of the people he had met, and the places he had seen. Samuel listened intently, fascinated by the stories of distant lands and lives lived differently from his own. He had been so focused on surviving the mountains that he had forgotten about the rest of the world. Elias's stories were a reminder that there was more out there, more to see, more to experience, more to understand. By midday, the sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. The landscape was quiet, the world still and peaceful. Samuel's thoughts drifted, his mind both focused and free. He found himself wondering if this was what he had been missing all along, a sense of purpose beyond survival, a sense of connection to something greater than himself. "We're heading for a settlement a few days out," Elias said, breaking the silence. "It's not much, but it's a place where people are trying to rebuild. People who don't think like us, who've never had to live in the wild, but they've got something we don't. They've got community." Samuel nodded, the idea of community both foreign and comforting. He had never been one for crowds, never had the need for anything beyond his own company. But Elias's words made him think. Community was something he had never fully understood. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about sharing the load, finding strength in others, and building something together that was stronger than what any one man could do alone. The journey to the settlement would take time, but Samuel was no longer in a hurry. The wilderness had taught him patience. It had stripped him of his arrogance and pride, leaving behind a man who understood that survival wasn't the ultimate goal. It was living fully and completely in every moment. As they continued through the snow, Samuel's thoughts drifted to the life he had left behind in the mountains. The hollow log cabin would remain standing, a testament to his determination, his ingenuity. But it wasn't the end of his story. It was just one chapter, and now, with Elias by his side, he was ready to turn the page. The days passed as Samuel and Elias continued their journey across the snow-covered landscape. The wilderness was vast, its silence broken only by the sound of their boots crunching in the snow and the occasional call of a distant animal. The weight of the mountains had begun to lift from Samuel's shoulders, replaced by a sense of anticipation that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't excitement exactly, but a quiet yearning, a hope that perhaps the next step on this journey would lead to something more meaningful. They camped under the stars each night, the cold of the mountain air pressing in around them. But the nights weren't as lonely anymore. Samuel had grown used to the quiet companionship of Elias. There was no need for constant chatter or forced conversation. Their shared silence was comfortable, and the warmth of the fire between them felt like a connection to the world outside the wilderness. They weren't alone anymore. They were two men walking a shared path. On the fourth day of their journey, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, Elias pointed ahead. "There it is," he said, his voice carrying the faintest hint of excitement. Samuel followed Elias's gaze and saw it, a small cluster of cabins in the distance, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines. The smoke rising from the chimneys and the faint outline of people moving about brought a sense of normalcy that felt foreign to Samuel. This was a place built by people, not nature, a place that existed outside of the wilderness Samuel had known for so long. As they drew closer, Samuel's nerves began to twist. He hadn't been around other people in so long, hadn't shared space with anyone except Elias. The thought of rejoining society, of entering a place where people lived in houses and worked together, was intimidating. What would they think of him? What would he think of them? The isolation had become a part of him, and now, as he stood on the edge of something different, he wondered if he was ready to make the shift. Elias seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's not much," he said with a smile, "but it's a start. You can't survive alone forever, Samuel. There are people here who understand what we've been through, and they're trying to rebuild something. Maybe it's time to see if you can be a part of that." Samuel nodded, though the thought still weighed heavily on him. He had spent so much of his life carving out a place in the wilderness, building his own sanctuary. But Elias was right. He couldn't keep running from the world forever. The mountains had given him strength, but they had also isolated him, and now it was time to see if there was more to life than just surviving. They walked toward the settlement, the cabins growing larger as they approached. Samuel could hear voices now, the murmur of conversation, the sound of work being done. It was strange and foreign, and yet there was a warmth in it, a sign that life could flourish outside the harshness of the wilderness. As they reached the first cabin, a man stepped out to greet them. He was older than Samuel, his face weathered by years of working the land. "Well, look at this," he said, smiling. "New faces. Welcome to our little corner of the world." Elias clapped the man on the back. "This is Samuel," he said. "He's been living off the land for a while, but I think he's ready to join the rest of us." Samuel offered a cautious smile, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This was the beginning of something new, something that required him to let go of the past and embrace the unknown. The first few days in the settlement were a blur of new faces, new routines, and new responsibilities. Samuel had always been accustomed to doing things on his own, building his cabin, hunting, gathering, but now he was surrounded by people who worked together to make the community function. It was a strange, humbling experience. No longer was he the sole architect of his own survival. He was one of many, contributing to something larger than himself. Elias introduced Samuel to the men and women who lived in the settlement, all of whom had their own stories of hardship and survival. There was Thomas, a blacksmith who had lost his family to a disease but had found solace in the work he did shaping metal. Then there was Mary, a young widow with 2 small children, who ran the small shop that served as the heart of the community. Everyone had a story, and Samuel began to realize that this place wasn't just about survival. It was about rebuilding what had been lost and creating something new. At first, Samuel felt like an outsider. He was different from the others, a man who had spent years living alone in the mountains. His skills were different from theirs, and his way of thinking was shaped by a life of isolation. But Elias had told him that finding a place in this new world would take time. He would have to prove himself, not just through his work, but through his willingness to be part of something greater. The first task Samuel took on was helping build a new barn for the settlement's animals. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it required the kind of strength and resilience Samuel knew well. He worked side by side with the others, learning their ways, understanding their approach to life. The work was hard, but it was rewarding. Each nail he hammered into the wood, each beam he lifted into place, brought him one step closer to understanding what it meant to belong. One evening, as Samuel sat around the fire with Elias and the others, he felt something shift within him. It was a quiet realization, but one that felt as real as the fire's warmth. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with it. The wilderness would always be a part of him, but it no longer held the power to define him. He had found something new, something that came not from isolation, but from connection. As the stars began to twinkle above, Samuel looked around at the people gathered around the fire, his new family. The road ahead was still uncertain, and he knew there would be more challenges to face. But for the first time in years, he was ready to face them, not alone, but with others by his side. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, and Samuel was finally ready to take the first step forward. Weeks passed, and Samuel's life in the settlement grew more familiar. The work was different, but it was rewarding. He no longer spent his days isolated, and for the first time, he found comfort in shared effort. Samuel had always known how to survive alone, but now, surrounded by others, he began to see strength in collaboration, in building something together. One afternoon, as Samuel helped Thomas with the blacksmithing tools, Thomas spoke quietly, as if testing the waters. "You've got good hands," he said, "but it's not just about doing things on your own, is it?" Samuel paused. He had always prided himself on his self-reliance, but over the past weeks the strength of community had become clear. "I guess I never really thought about it," Samuel replied. "I always thought survival was about standing alone, but I see now it's about finding your place within something bigger." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "It's different, but it's another kind of strength. You don't need to carry everything yourself. Sometimes we're stronger together." That evening, Samuel sat beside the fire, the crackling warmth a contrast to the biting cold outside. As he gazed into the flames, he felt a new sense of peace. The wilderness had taught him to endure, but now he was learning to thrive, not in isolation, but through connection. The strength he had found in the mountains had evolved. It was no longer just about surviving the harshness of the world. It was about sharing that survival with others and finding a new kind of strength in unity. Winter was deepening in the valley, and Samuel found himself standing at the edge of the settlement, staring at the snow-covered peaks in the distance. The mountains, once so familiar, now called to him in a way he couldn't ignore. The wilderness had shaped him, and it would always be a part of him, yet the life he had built here, the friendships, the work, the warmth of the fire, had become something he didn't want to leave behind. Elias, sensing Samuel's inner conflict, joined him by the edge of the settlement. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" Elias asked, his voice gentle. Samuel nodded. "The mountains, they're always there, always calling. I don't know if I can stay here." Elias didn't offer advice, just a knowing look. "The wilderness calls, Samuel, but remember, home doesn't have to be a place. It's the people you're with and what you build together." Samuel felt a shift in his heart. He wasn't leaving the mountains behind, he was carrying them with him. He had found something here that he never thought possible: community. It wasn't about choosing between the wilderness and the settlement, it was about accepting that he could be a part of both worlds. As the fire flickered in the distance, Samuel knew his journey was just beginning. The mountains would always be there, but so would the people he had come to care for. And perhaps that was the true meaning of home. As spring began to thaw the snow and coax life back into the valley, Samuel found himself standing once again on the edge of the settlement, gazing at the towering mountains in the distance. They loomed silently in the background, their peaks still heavy with snow, and despite the warmth in the air, the mountains called to him, an almost magnetic pull that had never quite loosened its grip. The people of the settlement had become his new family. He had worked beside them, laughed with them, and shared in their daily struggles. He had learned that strength wasn't just about surviving alone in the wilderness. It was about standing with others, working together, and building something that would last. But no matter how much he had embraced this new life, the mountains, with their wild beauty and harshness, still haunted his thoughts. Elias, noticing the change in his friend, sat beside him on a log one evening as the sun began to set. "You're thinking of leaving," Elias said, his voice calm but knowing. Samuel stared into the fire, the orange glow casting shadows on his face. "I don't know what to do, Elias. The mountains, they've always been a part of me. They're calling me again, and I don't know if I can ignore it." Elias nodded thoughtfully. "The mountains will always be there, Samuel. But this place, this life you've built, it's real too. You've found something here. You've found people." Samuel looked at Elias, his heart heavy. "But the call of the wild, it's different. It's a part of me that I can't explain. I thought I could stay here, but now I don't know if I can." Elias placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "The choice is yours, my friend. But remember, the wilderness doesn't just define you. What you've built here with these people, that's part of you too." The weight of the decision pressed on Samuel's chest, but Elias's words gave him a sense of clarity. He didn't have to choose one over the other. The mountains would always be with him, just as the people here would be. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn to belong to both worlds. Samuel's decision was made, and the time had come to leave the settlement. He had spent months among the people here, finding strength not just in the land, but in the bonds he had built. But now, as the warmth of spring spread across the valley, it was time to return to the mountains. Not because he wanted to escape, but because the mountains were still calling to him, whispering that his journey wasn't over. The morning he left, the sky was a soft blue, the sun shining warmly on the snow-capped peaks in the distance. The settlement was quiet, the usual sounds of life muted by the early hour. As Samuel packed his gear, Elias appeared at his side, his face calm but filled with understanding. "You sure about this?" Elias asked, his voice gentle. Samuel nodded, the decision weighing on him, but not with regret. "I need to go back. The mountains, They're where I truly feel alive. But I'm not leaving what I've found here behind. I'll carry it with me." Elias clasped Samuel's shoulder, a quiet farewell. "You'll always have a place here, but if you ever need to come back, you know where we are." With a final glance at the settlement, Samuel turned and began his journey up the familiar mountain path. The trail was steep, the snow soft underfoot, and the air thin with each breath. As he climbed higher, the sounds of the settlement faded, replaced by the familiar rustle of trees and the distant call of wildlife. Hours passed, and Samuel found himself at the ridge overlooking the valley. The settlement was just a speck now, tucked away in the corner of the land he had once tried to escape. But as he looked out at the expanse before him, Samuel felt something new, a sense of peace. The mountains were no longer a place of isolation. They were part of him, just as the people in the settlement had become part of him. And in that moment, he realized that his journey wasn't about choosing one over the other. It was about finding balance between the wild, the community, and the quiet strength of his own spirit. The path ahead was still long, and Samuel knew there would be more challenges, more lessons to learn. But for the first time, he felt ready to face the wilderness, ready to find his place in the world. And with the mountains stretching out before him, he felt as though he had finally found his home, not just in the wild, but in himself.